April 22nd, 1915, 1700 hours, Ypres, Belgium. The air felt thicker, heavier. For a moment it wasn't the sound of gunfire or the screams of men that pierced the stillness. It was something else, something invisible. Then in the distance a green haze billowed forward like an advancing army. It was the very breath of death, drifting across the battlefield, choking the life out of everything in its path. But this was no ordinary weapon. This was the birth of chemical warfare. The soldier's hands trembled as he adjusted his gas mask, his breath quick and shallow. Around him, men struggled with their own masks, the tension palpable. One soldier, his mask too small, stared wide-eyed, his hands fumbling helplessly as he gasped for air. The unmistakable stench of chlorine burned their throats, a bitter reminder that they were no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. He could feel the weight of every passing second, the agony of knowing that at any moment the gas could overcome them all. The trenches of the Western Front were already a hellish place, but the introduction of chemical warfare turned them into something far worse. Chlorine gas, then phosgene and mustard gas became not just weapons of war, but symbols of horror, tools of terror designed to break the human spirit. No one had ever seen or experienced anything like it. Unlike bullets or bombs, these gases had no regard for rank, no mercy for the innocent. They killed slowly, painfully, leaving those who survived scarred for life, both physically and mentally. What was once a battlefield was now an environment where men were stalked by invisible death. Chemical warfare during World War I marked a dark milestone in military history, forever altering the nature of combat. The strategic deployment of gas was not just a matter of advantage, it was a new weapon that defied the laws of nature itself. Over 1.3 million casualties, with more than 90,000 fatalities, were a result of chemical weapons. The gases didn't just kill, they maimed, mutilated, and disfigured. Soldiers would carry the scars for the rest of their lives, and many who survived would never again breathe a full, untroubled breath. The gas attacks were not just about the immediate deaths, but about the long-term psychological toll. In a war that already stretched human endurance to its breaking point, the introduction of a silent killer created a new form of trauma, one that left a generation of soldiers mentally and physically shattered. The very nature of warfare was forever changed. The very nature of warfare had been altered, but so too had the relationship between soldiers and their own humanity. The moment you couldn't trust the air you breathed, when the sky itself became an enemy. It was no longer about nations or flags. It was about survival at any cost. Chemical weapons were not just a military tactic. They were an assault on the soul of warfare itself. No longer could the soldiers hold on to the idea that they were fighting in a battle with rules, that there was some measure of honor in the chaos. The air had betrayed them. On April 22, 1915, something happened that would echo through history. At the Battle of Ypres, the Germans unleashed the first major gas attack in history. Thousands of men standing in their trenches heard a hiss, then saw the green fog drifting towards them. What followed was nothing short of a nightmare. The gas tore through the ranks, choking men, blinding them, filling their lungs with a death they couldn't fight. Those who tried to run were suffocated by their own terror, unable to escape the invisible killer that pursued them across the battlefield. But as the gas cloud rolled over the men, a terrible realization set in. They were defenseless. There were no tactics for this, no countermeasure, no heroic charge that could save them. It wasn't a bullet that would kill them. It wasn't a shell that would claim their lives. It was the very air they breathed. The effects of the gas were catastrophic, but they didn't end when the battle did. The men who survived the attack faced a lifetime of consequences. Many were permanently scarred by the gas, their skin burned, their lungs scarred, and their minds shattered. Those who breathed in the chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were left with chronic respiratory issues, lifelong disabilities, and for many, a haunting, constant reminder of the horrors they had lived through. But even worse was the unseen damage, the psychological toll. For decades after the war, soldiers who had been exposed to gas suffered from what would later be known as shell shock, a condition now recognized as PTSD. Their minds, like their bodies, had been poisoned by the war's horrors. No amount of time or medical care could undo the trauma of knowing that death could strike without warning, without sound, and from the very air they breathed. War is an ancient part of human history, but the introduction of chemical weapons represented something profoundly different, a shift from the tangible to the intangible, from the visible to the invisible. It was no longer just man against man. It was nature itself turned against mankind. For the first time in history, the battlefield became a place where the air itself could kill. And the psychological and physical consequences of this new warfare would reverberate long after the fighting stopped. The tragedy of chemical weapons lies not only in their immediate destruction, but in what they represented: a war against humanity. The question was no longer how to win the battle, but how to preserve what it meant to be human in the midst of such inhumanity. Could humanity still retain its honor and dignity when it fought against a weapon that had no honor, no dignity? When victory was not won by skill, strength, or courage, but by the silent, invisible poison that smothered all hope. April 22nd, 1915, 1700 hours. Ypres, Belgium. The wind still blows over the battlefield, carrying with it a faint, lingering memory of the horrors that once unfolded here. The trenches, long abandoned, have since filled with grass, but the air never forgets. It carries the weight of what was lost, what was sacrificed, and what was forever changed in the name of war. And the world continues, forever haunted by the question, what is the price of such power, and who is left to pay it? The gas didn't simply suffocate, it consumed. The soldiers, blinded by the stinging burn in their eyes, gasped, clawing at their masks, their hands trembling in frantic desperation. The world around them, once filled with the sounds of battle, was now eerily silent, save for the suffocating hiss of the gas creeping closer. In that moment, it wasn't the fear of dying that overwhelmed them. It was the sheer helplessness, the realization that there was no escape. They ran, but the gas was already ahead of them. It moved faster, more relentless than any enemy they had ever faced. The air grew colder, thicker, and then the coughing started. The burning sensation in their chest tightened into something far worse, the slow, suffocating death that no man could outrun. The soldiers fell one by one, not to bullets or bombs, but to the very breath of death. Even those who escaped the gas's immediate grasp found that the true consequences lay in the lingering effects. Many returned home, but no longer as the men they once were. Their lungs, scarred beyond repair, made every breath feel like a war in itself. Their minds, forever shattered by what they had witnessed, carried the burden of something far more insidious, the unrelenting terror of knowing that death could come from something as simple as the air itself. What do you do when the very world around you turns on you? The soldiers who returned from the front lines didn't just fight a physical war, they fought an invisible one that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Their bodies had been broken, but their spirits? Those too were left in pieces. War has always been a test of humanity's limits. But what happens when the very fabric of human existence is altered? When the rules of combat are no longer grounded in the tangible and the observable, but in the invisible? The introduction of chemical weapons during WWI didn't just change how battles were fought, it changed how soldiers fought themselves. The invisible poison not only ravaged their bodies, but waged war on their souls, leaving scars that would never heal. We have to ask ourselves, in the pursuit of victory, where does humanity go? When does power become too much? And when we cross these lines, what do we lose along the way? The horror of chemical warfare didn't emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a long history of technological innovation and a desperate need for a tactical advantage in a brutal war of attrition. The idea of using chemicals as weapons had been around for decades, but it was during World War I that the full scale of its potential was realized. For centuries, battlefields had been dominated by traditional weapons, guns, swords, and cannons. These weapons, while deadly, followed a set of understandable rules. You could see the enemy, you could hear the shots, and there was always a chance to evade or fight back. But with the introduction of chemical weapons, these rules were shattered. Gas didn't just kill, it controlled the battlefield in ways no weapon had before. It turned the very environment into an enemy. Imagine for a moment being trapped in a trench, unable to see or escape the invisible enemy that creeps closer with every passing second. You can't hear it coming, and you can't fight back. It's not a battle for territory, it's a battle for the air you breathe. The soldiers in the trenches didn't just face the stress of combat. They faced the fear of an invisible force that could take their lives at any moment, without warning. The deployment of chemical weapons in WWI marked a turning point in the way nations approached war. The military-industrial complex that had long been focused on the development of weapons of mass destruction now had an entirely new horizon to explore. Chemical weapons, unlike other forms of armament, could be produced in large quantities and used to cripple an enemy without the need for direct combat. The gas attacks introduced new forms of psychological warfare. It wasn't just about causing physical harm, it was about creating a sense of dread, a sense of inevitable death. The German military first deployed chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, but the technology didn't stop there. Phosgene gas, even more deadly, was introduced later that year, followed by mustard gas in 1917. The use of these gases in combat wasn't just strategic, it was designed to break the morale of the enemy. Soldiers had no defenses against it. Gas masks were rudimentary at best, offering minimal protection. As the war progressed, the realization that these weapons could potentially end the war in a quicker, more efficient manner by breaking the will to fight began to spread. However, it wasn't just the opposing soldiers who suffered. Civilians were also at risk, particularly those living in areas near the front lines. The gases didn't differentiate between soldier and civilian. The horrors of gas warfare were felt across the civilian populations as well, further compounding the terror of total war. The introduction of chemical warfare didn't just have immediate physical consequences, it created a psychological strain that extended far beyond the battlefields. The fear of an invisible enemy, the suffocation of breathing poisoned air, and the uncertainty of whether the next breath might be your last, left deep scars. In a war already characterized by overwhelming loss, soldiers now had to deal with the psychological terror of knowing that death could come not from a bullet or a bomb, but from something as mundane as the air they breathed. For the men exposed to gas attacks, there was a distinct difference between physical wounds and mental scars. The visible injuries were terrible: burns, disfigurement, blindness, and scarred lungs. But it was the unseen trauma that persisted the longest. This invisible battle, fought within the minds of the soldiers, created a new kind of war experience, one that extended far beyond the battlefield. The introduction of chemical weapons in WWI raised profound ethical and philosophical questions about the nature of warfare itself. For centuries, war had been fought with a certain set of expectations. Soldiers would face each other, fighting for their respective causes with some measure of honor and mutual understanding that this was the nature of conflict. But the use of chemical weapons shattered these conventions. In a war where millions had already died, where the rules of engagement had already been bent, the introduction of gas attacks represented something entirely new, a break from the traditional understanding of combat. Chemical warfare didn't just redefine military strategy, it altered the very nature of war. It was no longer a battle of soldiers against soldiers, it was a battle against nature itself. For the first time, mankind was using a weapon that didn't just target flesh and blood. It targeted the environment in which the war was fought. The soldiers in the trenches didn't just face each other, they faced an invisible force that had no regard for human life. The introduction of gas warfare forced humanity to confront the terrifying truth. In war, nothing was sacred. The scale of chemical weapon use during World War I was staggering. Between 1915 and 1918, it is estimated that over 1.3 million soldiers were affected by chemical weapons. Of these, approximately 90,000 died from their injuries, while many others were permanently disabled. The use of chemical agents was not restricted to a single battle or a few isolated incidents. Instead, gas attacks became a regular tactic, used in numerous offensives on both the Western and Eastern fronts. The most common chemical agents used during WWI included chlorine gas. First deployed in April 1915, it caused severe damage to the respiratory system, leading to suffocation and death. Phosgene gas. Introduced in 1915, it was responsible for 85% of all chemical weapon-related deaths during the war. It caused severe lung damage and death within hours of exposure. Mustard gas. First used in 1917, it caused blistering of the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. It was one of the most persistent gases, lingering in the environment for days after being deployed. These weapons caused suffering on an unprecedented scale. Unlike conventional weapons, which could kill quickly, chemical weapons caused long, agonizing deaths. Soldiers could be exposed to gas and not die immediately, but suffer for days or even weeks, slowly losing their ability to breathe and function. Many soldiers reported feeling as though their bodies were being slowly consumed by the gas, a terrifying sensation that left deep psychological scars. The horrors of chemical warfare during World War I left an indelible mark on the soldiers, civilians, and nations involved. But the legacy of gas attacks didn't end with the signing of the armistice in 1918. In fact, the repercussions of chemical warfare echoed throughout the interwar period, influencing both military tactics and international diplomacy. While the devastating effects of chemical weapons on the battlefield were undeniable, the global community's response to this new form of warfare was complex and filled with uncertainty. After the war, the use of chemical weapons was condemned by various international organizations, but the enforcement of such condemnation was weak. The 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare, was a major step toward restricting their use. However, it didn't fully prevent nations from developing or stockpiling chemical weapons. In the years following the war, many countries, including the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, continued to maintain chemical arsenals for potential use in future conflicts. This contradiction between moral condemnation and the continuation of chemical weapon development underscores the complex legacy of WWI's gas warfare. Although countries agreed on paper to avoid such tactics, the fear of chemical warfare's effectiveness during future wars led many to continue investing in chemical research. The global community had yet to fully reckon with the weapon's potential, and the lessons of World War I seemed to fade as the years passed. The use of chemical weapons during WWI raised profound moral and ethical questions that continue to haunt modern warfare. Chemical weapons were designed to target not just soldiers, but the very essence of human life. Unlike traditional weapons, which typically cause death or injury through a direct, violent impact, chemical weapons incapacitate the victim in a slow, agonizing manner. The result is not only physical damage, but also psychological trauma that lingers long after the battle has ended. The moral dilemma surrounding chemical warfare lies in its indiscriminate nature. Unlike bombs or bullets, which at least allow for some measure of defense or escape, gas attacks are invisible and unpredictable. No one could anticipate when or where a gas attack would strike. It was a form of warfare that forced soldiers and civilians alike to live in constant fear, knowing that death could come at any moment from an unseen force. In the years following WWI, philosophers, military leaders, and lawmakers struggled to come to terms with the implications of chemical weapons. Were these weapons simply tools of war, to be used in the pursuit of victory? Or did their nature render them immoral by default, as weapons designed to cause suffering beyond the battlefield? Despite the Geneva Protocol and the moral objections raised against chemical warfare, the legacy of gas attacks would continue to influence later conflicts. The fear of chemical warfare resurfaced during World War II, particularly during the early stages of the war, when Nazi Germany developed large chemical weapon stockpiles. However, despite the devastating potential of these weapons, chemical warfare was largely avoided in WPU. As both sides feared the catastrophic consequences of full-scale chemical warfare. In the decades that followed, chemical weapons continued to be a tool of terror in various regional conflicts. The most notable instance occurred during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, when Iraq used chemical weapons extensively against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians. The international community, already deeply scarred by the events of WWI, condemned the use of chemical weapons, but enforcement of international laws remained difficult. This highlighted the persistent issue of non-compliance with treaties and the lack of effective deterrence for nations considering the use of such weapons. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, saw another resurgence of chemical weapon attacks. Despite international condemnation and the efforts of organizations like the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, the use of chemical weapons has continued to plague modern conflicts. This starkly contrasts with the promises made in the wake of WWI to never again resort to such inhumane tactics. The horrors of WWI, particularly the use of chemical weapons, led to a significant shift in international norms regarding warfare. The 1925 Geneva Protocol was an important first step in banning chemical weapons, but it was not until the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, came into force in 1997 that real progress was made toward eliminating chemical weapons on a global scale. The CWC, which has been signed by 193 countries, mandates the destruction of chemical weapons stockpiles and prohibits the use of chemical weapons in warfare. The global response to chemical warfare is a testament to the profound impact that the events of WWI had on the international community. After witnessing the devastating effects of chemical weapons, the world rallied around the idea that such weapons had no place in modern warfare. Despite the challenges of enforcing the CWC and the continued use of chemical weapons in certain regions, the international community has made great strides toward reducing the global stockpile of chemical agents and preventing their future use. Yet the question remains, can the world ever truly eliminate the threat of chemical warfare? The lessons of WWI seem to suggest that as long as nations maintain the capacity to develop and use these weapons, the specter of chemical warfare will continue to hang over the global stage. The introduction of chemical weapons into the theater of war raises essential ethical questions that resonate deeply in modern discussions about the nature of combat, human suffering, and the moral limits of technological innovation. Can there ever be a moral justification for the use of a weapon that causes suffering not only to its immediate victims, but to future generations? Chemical weapons challenge the very nature of warfare. While traditional weapons are designed for combat between opposing forces, chemical weapons blur the lines between combatants and non-combatants. They do not distinguish between soldier and civilian. The gas can wipe out entire towns, rendering people not only physically vulnerable, but also psychologically scarred. The question arises, should any weapon be allowed to exist that has the potential to dehumanize an entire population? Should such weapons, by their very nature, be considered immoral, regardless of their military utility? In the years following WWI, many nations worked to create international laws and treaties aimed at eliminating chemical weapons, recognizing that their existence poses a fundamental threat to human dignity and safety. But even as these weapons have been banned, they remain a powerful reminder of the atrocities that human ingenuity can create when it is turned to destruction rather than creation. The legacy of chemical warfare, born from the terror of the trenches in WWI, remains with us today, both as a warning and as a burden. The introduction of chemical weapons into warfare not only transformed the nature of combat, but also set the stage for the ongoing ethical debates surrounding the use of weapons of mass destruction. As long as chemical weapons continue to exist, so too will the fear and uncertainty they bring. For those who survived the horror of WWI's gas attacks, the memory of the invisible enemy will never fade. As the world moves forward, it is vital to reflect on the lessons of the past. The weapons may change, but the impact on humanity remains the same. And as history continues to unfold, we must ask ourselves, can we ever escape the legacy of chemical warfare? Or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? While the physical injuries caused by chemical weapons were horrific, blistered skin, burned lungs, and impaired vision, the psychological toll was equally, if not more, devastating. The introduction of gas warfare created an entirely new type of trauma, one that would haunt soldiers long after the war ended. Soldiers who survived gas attacks often experienced mental health issues that lasted for years. Many were diagnosed with shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. However, the unique nature of chemical warfare meant that the psychological effects were particularly devastating. Soldiers who survived the gas attacks often reported feelings of helplessness and paranoia, knowing that death could come at any time, from anywhere, without warning. Even those who were not directly exposed to the gas, but witnessed the suffering of their comrades, developed deep psychological scars. The fear of gas attacks didn't end when the war ended. Many soldiers continued to have nightmares, reliving the suffocation, the blinding pain, and the panic of the gas attacks. They were haunted by the knowledge that chemical weapons could strike at any time, and often experienced heightened anxiety, even when they were no longer in the war zone. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was deeply mental, and it left soldiers unable to ever truly escape the horrors of what they had witnessed and endured. To understand the full scale of the horror inflicted by chemical weapons, it's essential to look at the personal stories of those who lived through it. These testimonies, from both soldiers and civilians, offer a first-hand account of the terror caused by chemical warfare. One survivor, a British soldier named Sergeant James Thompson, described the terror of his first gas attack. "We were in the trenches when we saw the green cloud rolling towards us. No one knew what it was at first, but when the wind shifted and we started to feel it in our throats, that's when the panic started. I tried to put my mask on, but the air was thick with something burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I couldn't breathe, and I thought I was going to die right there in that trench." Thompson survived the attack, but his experience would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was one of the lucky ones. He managed to escape the immediate effects of the gas. However, for many others, survival meant living with the consequences of permanent lung damage, blindness, and burns. Worse still, many soldiers who had been exposed to the gas carried psychological scars that no amount of medical treatment could heal. The fear of gas attacks, the suffocating panic, the image of comrades falling around them, it all left a lasting impact. Another soldier, Private Albert Green, recalled the aftermath of the attack. "After the gas cleared, The field was full of men coughing and gagging, unable to breathe. Some were vomiting, others were writhing on the ground in pain. It was a scene I couldn't forget, and I couldn't stop thinking about the men who had died from it, the ones who couldn't even scream because their lungs were too full of gas. I've never been able to shake that image. It stayed with me every day after the war ended. These stories represent just a small fraction of the experiences of soldiers who survived chemical attacks. While their bodies might have healed, their minds never fully recovered. The lasting psychological trauma was something that was largely ignored at the time, but in hindsight, it's clear that the scars left by chemical warfare ran far deeper than the visible wounds. While the immediate focus of chemical warfare was on the battlefield, the impact of gas attacks extended far beyond the front lines. Civilian populations, especially those living in areas near the battlefields, were also vulnerable to the devastating effects of chemical weapons. In cities like Ypres, which saw multiple gas attacks during the war, civilians were forced to deal with the lingering effects of chemical exposure. The gas that was used on the battlefield didn't just vanish after the fighting stopped. It settled into the ground, the air, and even into the water, creating a toxic environment for those who lived nearby. In many cases, entire communities were affected by the chemical weapons, with families suffering from respiratory issues, skin burns, and psychological trauma. Entire generations were scarred by the effects of gas warfare, with children and non-combatants being particularly vulnerable. In some cases, families living near the front lines had no idea what was happening until it was too late. The gas attacked without warning, and there was no defense. The long-term effects of chemical warfare on civilians were also felt in the form of healthcare crises. Hospitals and medical institutions were overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties, many of whom required long-term care for the physical and mental consequences of chemical exposure. Doctors and nurses, already dealing with the immense strain of treating wounded soldiers, found themselves unequipped to deal with the complex medical issues posed by chemical warfare. The need for specialized care, including treatment for respiratory illnesses and skin conditions, placed a strain on healthcare systems that would take years to recover. The use of chemical weapons in WWI had a profound effect not only on those directly affected by the attacks, but also on the broader geopolitical landscape. As nations witnessed the devastation caused by gas attacks, they began to rethink their approach to military technology and warfare in general. Following the war, the development of chemical weapons became a focal point for arms control discussions. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, attempted to establish frameworks for arms reduction and disarmament. However, the inherent dangers of chemical weapons remained a significant challenge. Nations that had used chemical weapons during WWI were reluctant to give up their arsenals, fearing that they might be left vulnerable in future conflicts. The 1925 Geneva Protocol, which aimed to ban the use of chemical and biological weapons, was a significant first step in arms control, but its enforcement was weak. Nations like the United States, France, and the United Kingdom continued to develop and stockpile chemical weapons throughout the 20th century, despite the treaty. As the decades passed and the threat of nuclear warfare emerged, chemical weapons seemed to fade into the background. However, the fear of chemical attacks never fully disappeared. The development of more sophisticated chemical weapons continued in some countries, and the memories of WWI's gas attacks remained a dark chapter in the history of modern warfare. Although chemical weapons were thought to be a relic of past wars, the reality is far more unsettling. The legacy of chemical warfare is not confined to the history books. As recent as the Syrian civil war, the world has witnessed the use of chemical weapons in active conflict, a grim reminder that the specter of chemical warfare still looms. In 2013, the Syrian government was accused of using sarin gas in an attack that killed hundreds of civilians in the suburbs of Damascus. This was not an isolated incident. There have been numerous reports of chemical weapon attacks throughout the Syrian conflict, underscoring the ongoing vulnerability of civilian populations in modern warfare. Despite international outrage and the condemnation of such actions by the United Nations, enforcement of chemical weapons bans has been inconsistent, with few lasting consequences for the perpetrators. The international community, while united in its condemnation of chemical attacks, has often been paralyzed when it comes to taking significant action. The use of chemical weapons in Syria has raised new questions about the effectiveness of international treaties and laws designed to prevent their use. The Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, which was signed by 193 countries, prohibits the development, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. However, the continued use of these weapons in conflict zones like Syria highlights the gaps in enforcement and the challenges of holding violators accountable. While the CWC has led to the destruction of chemical weapon stockpiles in many nations, its failure to prevent their use in certain conflicts is a stark reminder that the threat of chemical warfare is not over. The presence of chemical weapons in global conflict zones undermines the progress that has been made in international disarmament, and the use of such weapons in modern conflicts raises questions about the future of arms control. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, has been at the forefront of efforts to enforce the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC. Founded in 1997, the OPCW is tasked with overseeing the destruction of chemical weapon stockpiles and verifying compliance with the CWC. In 2013, the OPCW was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts to eliminate chemical weapons. Its work has led to the destruction of over 70% of the declared chemical weapon stockpiles, a significant achievement in the fight against these weapons. However, the OPCW's role is far from straightforward. Its capacity to enforce compliance is limited, as it relies on the cooperation of member states. In cases where chemical weapons are used in conflict, as in Syria, the OPCW has been able to investigate and confirm the use of chemical agents, but the subsequent action taken against the perpetrators has often been limited. The OPCW has been criticized for its inability to prevent the use of chemical weapons in ongoing conflicts, as it does not have the mandate to intervene militarily or impose punitive measures. The challenge of disarming the world of chemical weapons is also compounded by the emergence of new technologies. Advances in biotechnology and nanotechnology could lead to the development of new forms of chemical agents that are more difficult to detect and defend against. This makes the task of monitoring and enforcing chemical weapons bans even more complex. As technology evolves, the international community will need to adapt its strategies for arms control and disarmament to address these emerging threats. Despite these challenges, the OPCW remains a vital institution in the global effort to eliminate chemical weapons. Its work in verifying compliance, destroying stockpiles, and investigating the use of chemical weapons in conflict zones provides the foundation for continued efforts to address the threat posed by these weapons. While the use of chemical weapons has been banned for nearly a century, their deployment in modern-day conflict zones reveals a disturbing trend. Chemical weapons remain a weapon of choice for some regimes and non-state actors who seek to terrorize civilian populations or gain military advantage. In addition to the Syrian civil war, there have been several other instances of chemical weapon use in recent conflicts. In the Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, Iraq used chemical weapons against both Iranian forces and Kurdish civilians. The infamous Halabja massacre in 1988 saw the Iraqi government deploy chemical weapons, including mustard gas and nerve agents, against the Kurdish population, killing thousands of men, women, and children. This act of mass murder became one of the most horrific chapters in the history of chemical warfare. Despite the clear violation of international law, Iraq faced little immediate consequence for its actions. Another more recent instance occurred in 2017, when a chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun, Syria, resulted in over 80 deaths. The attack was attributed to Syrian government forces using sarin gas, a nerve agent that causes rapid suffocation and death. The international community condemned the attack, and the United States launched missile strikes in retaliation. However, the use of chemical weapons continued in subsequent attacks, further highlighting the inability of the international community to stop their use. These instances of chemical weapon use demonstrate that while international law may prohibit their deployment, it does little to stop rogue regimes and non-state actors from using them. The global community's response to these incidents has often been slow and fragmented, highlighting the challenges of enforcing disarmament and holding violators accountable. The use of chemical weapons in modern warfare raises profound ethical and legal questions. These weapons are not only horrific in their effects, but they are also considered a violation of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions prohibit the use of chemical and biological weapons, and the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, aims to completely eliminate these weapons from the global arsenal. The ethical questions surrounding chemical weapons are rooted in their nature. Unlike conventional weapons, which aim to kill or incapacitate through direct force, chemical weapons cause suffering in a way that is both slow and agonizing. The long-term health consequences of exposure to chemical agents, including neurological damage, respiratory issues, and cancer, are a heavy burden for survivors. These weapons also disproportionately affect non-combatants, including women and children, making them particularly inhumane. Legally, the use of chemical weapons is considered a war crime, and those responsible for deploying them should be held accountable. However, the enforcement of these laws remains inconsistent. While international bodies like the International Criminal Court, ICC, can prosecute individuals for war crimes, the difficulty in gathering evidence and the lack of political will often result in impunity for those who use chemical weapons. The challenge for the global community is not just to condemn the use of chemical weapons, but to create a system that ensures perpetrators are held accountable, and the use of such weapons is completely eradicated. This will require stronger enforcement mechanisms, more robust international cooperation, and a willingness to act when violations occur. Looking to the future, the threat of chemical warfare remains one of the most persistent challenges in global security. The potential for new technologies to create more lethal and harder to detect chemical agents makes it imperative that the international community remain vigilant. The continued existence of chemical weapons, despite decades of disarmament efforts, demonstrates the limitations of international treaties and agreements. The future of chemical weapons will likely depend on the advancement of detection technologies, greater international cooperation, and the continued work of organizations like the OPCW. It will also require the development of stronger measures for verification and compliance with disarmament agreements. As new chemical agents emerge, the global community will need to work together to ensure that such weapons are not used in future conflicts, and that those who violate international laws are held accountable. Since the end of World War I, technological advancements have fundamentally changed the way chemical weapons are developed, deployed, and countered. While the 1915 chlorine gas attacks were the first of their kind, the technology behind chemical warfare has evolved dramatically over the past century. The development of more sophisticated chemical agents, more efficient delivery systems, and improved detection and defense mechanisms has led to a more complex and dangerous threat in modern warfare. In the early 20th century, the primary chemical agents used in warfare were chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas. These chemicals were relatively simple in their chemical composition and could be produced in large quantities. However, they had significant limitations. Chlorine gas, for example, was easily neutralized by wind, and mustard gas, while persistent, took time to take effect. By the mid-20th century, more potent nerve agents such as sarin, VX, and tabun were developed. These agents are significantly more toxic than earlier chemicals and act more quickly, making them far deadlier. One of the most significant technological advancements in chemical warfare has been the development of aerosol delivery systems. Whereas the early gas attacks relied on the wind to carry chemicals across the battlefield, modern delivery systems, such as rockets, missiles, and artillery shells, allow for the precise and targeted release of chemical agents. This development increases the lethality of chemical weapons and makes them harder to defend against, as they can be delivered swiftly and efficiently, regardless of the wind direction. Additionally, the advancement of binary chemical weapons, weapons that combine two relatively harmless chemicals to create a lethal agent, has made chemical warfare even more efficient. These weapons are safer to handle and transport, as the chemicals are not dangerous until they are mixed. This innovation has led to the proliferation of chemical weapons in some regions, as countries have found it easier to produce and store these agents without risking premature detonation or toxicity. However, as chemical weapons have advanced, so too have efforts to develop countermeasures. Protective gear, such as gas masks, chemical suits, and protective eyewear, have evolved significantly since the early days of chemical warfare. Modern soldiers are equipped with much more effective protection against chemical agents, which has, in turn, changed the dynamics of battlefield tactics. The development of early detection systems, such as handheld sensors and automated chemical agent alarms, allows soldiers to detect chemical agents quickly and take the necessary precautions. Despite these advancements in defense and detection, the evolving nature of chemical weapons remains a significant challenge. New chemical agents continue to emerge, and countries and terrorist organizations are finding ways to circumvent international regulations. With the advent of biotechnology and nanotechnology, future chemical weapons could be even more deadly, harder to detect, and even harder to defend against. In response to the growing threat of chemical weapons, both international organizations and national governments have implemented various security measures to prevent their use. The Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, established in 1997, remains the cornerstone of global efforts to eliminate chemical weapons. The CWC is a multilateral treaty that obligates its signatories to destroy their chemical weapons stockpiles, refrain from the development or use of chemical weapons, and assist in the destruction of chemical weapons in other countries. Over 193 countries have signed the treaty, representing a significant international commitment to the elimination of these weapons. While the CWC has been successful in promoting the destruction of chemical weapons stockpiles, its enforcement has been limited. The challenge of ensuring compliance with the treaty has been exacerbated by the lack of verification mechanisms in some countries and the persistent threat of chemical weapons use in conflict zones. In cases where chemical weapons are used, the international community has struggled to respond effectively, often relying on weak diplomatic measures or sanctions. On the national level, countries have enacted strict security measures to safeguard against the use of chemical weapons. Governments have developed intelligence gathering systems to monitor the activities of known chemical weapons producers and to track the movement of chemical agents across borders. Many countries have implemented stockpile surveillance programs to ensure that chemical weapons are properly disposed of and are not falling into the wrong hands. These programs are particularly important in preventing non-state actors, such as terrorist organizations, from acquiring chemical weapons. In addition to traditional security measures, there has been growing interest in non-proliferation efforts to prevent the spread of chemical weapons technology. International cooperation in the form of intelligence sharing, export controls, and disarmament verification programs is vital to preventing the further proliferation of chemical weapons. Countries that possess chemical weapons or related technology are subject to regular inspections by international bodies like the OPCW to ensure compliance with disarmament agreements. Despite these efforts, challenges remain. The ease with which chemical weapons can be produced, particularly in small-scale laboratories, has made it difficult to completely eliminate the threat. Additionally, the rise of non-state actors, including terrorist organizations like ISIS, has introduced a new dimension to the chemical weapons threat. These groups have demonstrated a willingness to use chemical weapons as tools of terror, and the international community has been forced to confront the reality that chemical weapons may be used in ways that were previously unimaginable. In modern military strategy, chemical weapons are largely viewed as weapons of last resort. The threat of their use is often seen as a deterrent rather than a tactic that is actively employed. In most conflicts, countries are hesitant to deploy chemical weapons due to the significant international repercussions that would follow. The use of chemical weapons is a violation of international law, and countries that use them risk facing military retaliation, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. However, there are certain situations where chemical weapons might still be viewed as strategically useful. In a protracted conflict, where a nation faces overwhelming conventional forces or has no other means of gaining a military advantage, the use of chemical weapons might be seen as a way to break the stalemate. Chemical weapons can cause widespread panic, disrupt enemy operations, and incapacitate large numbers of troops with relatively minimal effort. In the case of asymmetric warfare, where non-state actors or smaller nations face more powerful enemies, chemical weapons may be seen as a means of leveling the playing field. Terrorist groups, in particular, have increasingly turned to chemical weapons as a way to instill fear and terrorize civilian populations. The use of chemical weapons by non-state actors has proven particularly challenging for international security, as these groups are often difficult to track and hold accountable. One of the most troubling aspects of chemical weapons in modern military strategy is the fact that they are often used in combination with other weapons of mass destruction, such as biological or nuclear weapons. These hybrid warfare strategies combine chemical weapons with conventional military tactics to create an even more devastating effect. For instance, chemical weapons might be used to incapacitate enemy forces or civilian populations, while nuclear weapons are used to secure a victory. Such strategies increase the scale of destruction and make it harder to effectively retaliate. While most nations have signed treaties prohibiting the use of chemical weapons, the possibility remains that they could be deployed in future conflicts, especially if international relations continue to deteriorate or if new technological developments create even more deadly chemical agents. April 22, 1915, 1700 hours, Ypres, Belgium. The wind still whispers across the battlefield, carrying with it the memory of what transpired in this place, where humanity crossed a line, where the air itself became a weapon of death. The trenches, now quiet, no longer echo with the sounds of suffering and terror. But for those who survived, the memory of that invisible enemy is ever present. The ghosts of those who were lost linger, carried in the breaths of the living. And so the world moves on, but the legacy of chemical warfare endures. As new technologies emerge, as old treaties are tested, the spectre of the gas cloud that once choked the very breath of soldiers on the front lines remains, ever haunting the global stage. The question still remains, can humanity truly overcome the darkness it has created, or will the breath of death continue to haunt us all? April 22, 2025, 1700 hours, Ypres, Belgium. 100 years later, the air is still heavy with the weight of history, and the world continues to wrestle with the haunting question, what is the price of power, and who is left to pay it?